All right. So 2 Samuel 14. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. So evidently David was yearning after Absalom, who he had banished. Well, Absalom actually banished himself, but the king didn't say, Absalom, come back, come back. So Joab, who was a member of the king's court, he'd be in and out all the time, so he knew that David did yearn for Absalom. And Joab, verse 2, sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go into the king, and here's what I want you to say to him. So Joab put words in her mouth. Now, my big question when I was starting to study this was, what was Joab's motivations? He was a scoundrel, really, he was. So I thought, what difference did it make for Joab to do something for Absalom or David in this case? And I did, I was reading a commentary, and I did, it's like a light dawned, and I thought, okay, I bet you that's true. So this is the Bible commentary by Craig Morrison. Joab's motives for fabricating this scene are now emerging. He is establishing himself as the person upon whom Absalom must depend in order to re-enter the king's good graces. So Joab is looking out for Joab, and he knows that David won't be king forever. And with Amnon, the oldest son, gone, and the second son was, I don't know how you pronounce it, it's Kileab. He was Abigail's son. We don't hear, aside from that he was born, we don't hear anything else from him. So either he died or something was not right with him, so he was not in the running for. So Absalom was the next one who would inherit the throne. And so Joab is looking ahead and thinking, okay, I'm going to make it so that Absalom is indebted to me. Yes, that's a good way to put it. So that makes perfect sense, knowing Joab as we know him so far. Now, it's interesting that Joab fabricated a story, and it reminds us of the story that Nathan, I think God inspired Nathan with that story, because Nathan it caused David to realize, I am that man. I am the one who did that. Well, maybe because of that, Joab thought, well, I'm going to make up a story too. I told Mom I'm going to make up a story too. But anyway, so Joab made up this story, and he had a good story. Verse 4, when the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and paid homage and said, save me, O king. Now, David doesn't know that this is all fabricating, but we know because we've been told already. And the king said to her, what is your trouble? And she said, alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead, and your servant had 2 sons. They quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole clan has risen against your servant, and they say, give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. And so they would destroy the heir also. And it was a good story. You can imagine a woman having 2 sons, and now she's going to lose both of them because one was dumb and killed one. Thus they would quench the coal that is left, speaking of the son that's remaining to inherit, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. So here she is, this widow, she won't have anybody if this son is taken. Notice in verse 7, and now the whole clan, what does it say? And behold, the whole family is risen against thine handmaid. This could indicate that David, because the story is basically about David and Absalom, it could indicate that David's entire family, who was at the palace, was against Absalom. and with good reason. So then the king said to the woman, I'm in verse 8, go to your house and I'll give orders concerning you. Maybe he wanted to think about it and didn't want to make a decision right then, but she didn't want to be satisfied with that, and probably Joab had coached her and said, no, we've got to carry it out so until we get to a certain point. He's wanting David to see his heart. So the woman of Tekoa said to the king, on me be the guilt, my lord king, and on my father's house. Let the king and his throne be guiltless. In other words, if David were to go ahead and rule that the son could live, she said, because he was supposed, by the law, he should die. But if David forgave him or granted him amnesty, then if there was any problem with that, she said, let the guilt be on me and my family, not on you. The king said, if anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again. But she presses David even more. She said, verse 11, please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son be not destroyed. In other words, she wanted a stronger insurance that no one would touch her son. And so the king complies. He says, as the Lord lives, and that's an oath. So he's saying, I swear as the Lord lives, that, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. And he said this, not knowing this son at all, just on the grounds of what she had told him. Then the woman said, and when as I read this, I thought, she had a lot of courage. He could have just had her killed right there. Please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. And he said, speak. And the woman said, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which can't be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. And somebody mentioned that David might have been, during some of the questions, he might have been thinking of his own sin and felt guilty and not wanted to bring judgment because he was more guilty than Amnon at first, of course not than Absalom, because Absalom committed murder too. But anyway, God had granted grace to David. David should have died for his sin. But God he had mercy. And it's because he knew David's heart. And so this lady is saying, it may be, let me see, God will not take away life. He devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. In other words, God has grace. Now, verse 15, I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid, and your servant thought, I will speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his servant. It's almost like she thinks she's said enough about that, about saying, David, this is you, and then goes back to her request. For the king will hear and deliver his servant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the heritage of God. And your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest. For my lord the king is like the angel of God to discern good and evil. The Lord your God be with you. I think she's going overboard now. She needed to stop a little bit before. Because now look at the next verse. Because of her pressing it and going on, verse 18, then the king answered the woman, do not hide from me anything I ask you. And she said, let my lord the king speak. The king said, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? And this makes me wonder if Joab hadn't maybe tried before to get him to have Absalom return. Joab and David had a lot to do with each other. And so he just saw Joab's hand in this. The woman answered and said, as surely as you live, my lord the king, one cannot turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that the Lord my king has said. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant. In order to change the course of things, your servant Joab did this. but my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth. Maybe she was thinking, David might get me. I need to make sure he doesn't. It really is laughable. Then the king said to Joab, now we don't know if Joab was there at the same time she was saying this. My guess is that he probably was. So he turns to Joab and says, behold, now I grant this. Go, bring back the young man Absalom. Because if he's willing to grant amnesty to somebody he doesn't even know based on just this lady's story, why can't he bring Absalom back? So, verse 22, Joab fell on his face to the ground and paid homage and blessed the king. Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord the king, in that the king has granted the request of his servant. And I think we can read that with a grain of salt, because he's outwardly paying homage to David as king, but inwardly Joab never even bats an eye at doing something David does not want him to do, at disobeying him whenever he sees fit. Joab does what Joab wants to do. So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, now notice verse 24, let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence. So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. So he brought Absalom back, but what he in effect was saying, you're not welcome here at the palace, but you can be back in Jerusalem. And his reasons for doing that, we can only conjecture. It could be the rest of his family still, that maybe he thought they'd all have a cow if he had Absalom just come back. Because remember, other than David really hasn't done any judging towards Absalom either. And so the banishing could have been somewhat of a judgment, but that was Absalom's own doing pretty much, except he didn't come back until the king asked him to. But I just could not help but compare this to the prodigal son. Remember, and this is in Luke 15:20, and I'm not going to turn there, but we know the story well. The neatest part of that story is when the prodigal son comes to his senses, and it says that, it describes it that way, and realizes he's out there eating the same food that the pigs are eating because he's famished. He has no money. He probably has not a very good place to live either. And his father is a wealthy man just over in wherever. So, and he knows his father. And he thinks, I'm going to tell him. I'm going to tell him I'm sorry. And I believe at that point he was sorry. It was a real thing. And he thought, I don't deserve to be his son. But I could live as a slave in his house better than I'm living right now, and at least get something to eat so I don't die of starvation. So he's got in his mind, he plans it all, what he's going to say. Don't let me even, I'm not trying to be your son, but can I live as a slave in your house? So he's still a long ways away, but the dad can see him. And what does he do? He runs to him. That is one of the neatest stories in the Bible, I think. So all that young man had done, squandered his dad's inheritance, just did whatever he wanted, and when he had hard times, he's coming back. And the dad could justifiably been kind of upset with that guy. I mean, the older brother was. But the father loved him and made him his son again, put a robe on him, a ring on his finger, shoes on his feet. He was treated as not just a son, but a very much loved son. But David didn't do that with Absalom. And I feel bad for David. He was a man after God's own heart, but he was very unwise in what he did here. I don't know Absalom's heart, but I know that David could have perhaps made a difference in the way Absalom felt and thought by the way, and he brought Absalom back and refused to see him.
Well, that's unforgiveness.
Yeah, it is unforgiveness. That's what it seems to be. And what does that do to Absalom? We can see. We're going to see. We're going to read what it does to Absalom. One thing I want to say before we go on, do you think how dear to God's heart is reconciliation?
He sent his son to take care of it.
Yes. And you talked about, reconciliation, forgiveness between family members. That is why God sent Jesus. We needed to be reconciled to God because of all the things we had done. And it was only made possible when God gave his son to make that possible. So, is it dear to God's heart? You bet. So, first of all, in 2 Corinthians 5:18, all this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. He doesn't want it to stop with just us and God. How bad does it make us feel as parents when two of our children are at odds and won't reconcile? It's very sorrowful. That is in verse 19 of 1 Corinthians 5. In Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the ministry of reconciliation. He basically says the same thing in two different verses. We have a ministry. In other words, God wants us to be busy about bringing reconciliation to others. And so, do we need to be reconciled to our brother or sister? Is it very important that we forgive? I think it's everything for us to do that. I think that stops everything in our spiritual growth if we don't. It makes our heart hard. It just, God is for reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. Paul says, we implore you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. Now back in our chapter 14, verse 25. This is like an interjection because of the events of the story that unfold later. Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. One of the books I read said that this could be around 5 pounds of hair. There were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. Interesting, he doesn't give anything about the sons, no names, nothing, but tells the daughter's name was Tamar because we need to remember that he had a sister named Tamar, and the daughter was probably named after her. She was a beautiful woman. So enough time has passed for Absalom to have a family, and he could have had this family also just sometime during this time. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. 2 years, that's a long time. Remember that Absalom had been in Geshur for 3 years. So it's been 5 years now since Amnon was killed. That was plenty of time for rebellion to fester and vengeance in his heart. And at any time, had David stepped in and made some judgments, that would have helped, might have taken care of it. And had he made things right with Absalom and forgiven him, and when we forgive others, it gives them an opportunity to forgive us, then there wouldn't have been this festering in Absalom's heart. I've always thought Absalom was pretty much of a scoundrel, and he was, but his life might have been a little bit different had his father treated him differently.
Probably felt rejected, and that rejection possible,
Yes, yes. That doesn't excuse Absalom, but it sure does help us to understand him a little bit more. So, verse 29, then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king. But Joab would not come to him. I think Joab thought he'd done plenty, and he didn't want to get involved anymore. And so he sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Then he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is next to mine. He has barley there. Go and set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house. He got what he wanted. And remember, he's related to Joab. So, why have your servants set my field on fire? And well, he should have known. Absalom answered Joab. He doesn't even say anything about the fire. He said, behold, I sent word to you, come here that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me to be there still. Now, therefore, let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death. He's ready for his life to be something different than this silent rejection, like one was saying. And I don't blame him for that. But he wasn't concerned at all with pleasing God, and this is very evident. But he was tired of being an outcast and rejected, and so he was wanting to change things. I don't know why he didn't just go to David, but maybe he thought Joab had an inroad because it was Joab that came and figured out how to get him back from Geshur. Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So we see that now this kiss that David gave to Absalom is reconciliation. So he's now come into the presence of the king, and so now there is forgiveness. But I think it's too late. So let's go ahead and go into chapter 15. It's as if the last verse of chapter 14 didn't make any difference at all. So we see in verse 1, chapter 15, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. So back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 11, this is Samuel talking to Israel about their desire for a king. He says, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. So we can see that for a person to get yourself a chariot and horses and men to run before him, he's got the throne in mind. That's what kings do. And so Absalom is, we already see from the very first verse what's in his mind. Also, in 1 Kings 1:5, and this person, Adonijah, is Absalom's brother. Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. This was after Absalom was already gone. Adonijah is the next one in line, evidently. And so he said, I'm going to be king. And here's how he did that. He prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. So we see in those two places, that's what Absalom had in mind in verse 1. Now we see another thing that Absalom does. He's conniving. And he realizes that he's going to need some help if he is going to defeat David and take over the throne. My question that I don't have an answer for yet, and so you guys think about it too, is why Absalom didn't just wait until David passed away, and then I think he would have been next in line for the throne. Maybe he didn't want to wait very long. Maybe he wanted his throne right now, kind of like that prodigal son that didn't want to wait either. I don't know. But anyway, that was a thought of mine. Verse 2, and Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. So this was something that he did often. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, from what city are you? When he said, your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel, Absalom would say to him, see, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you. Then Absalom would say, oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. So this just gives us an idea of what Absalom was doing. And whenever a man came near enough to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. And I'm guessing that probably happened every day. And so Absalom put himself between those people and the king. He was pretty smart. It says, so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Now, sometimes we speak of that phrase, stealing the heart, in a good way, like your great-granddaughter's just stolen your heart, right? But here, the word steal, so Absalom stole, it means to thieve and deceive. So it's not a good term. So he was like a thief, stealing the hearts of the men of Israel from his father, and he was deceiving them. We can see from, David was a good ruler over Israel. He brought just judgment to Israel. We can see that. There was a verse that said that. But he did not judge his family like he should have. But Israel he did. And so the people that came to him, like we saw the widow that came to him, he would pronounce judgment for her. He was good. He didn't take bribes. He was a king that wanted to please God. That was in his heart. So as far as his relationship to the people of Israel, that was good. So this is the way Absalom chose to undermine that, because he knew that David was loved by the people. So he's a pretty smart guy. So in verse 7 of chapter 15, and at the end of 4 years, so he worked at this for a while, Absalom said to the king, please let me go and pay my vow, which I vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, if the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord. Well, this may or may not have been true. I question it, because Absalom didn't care about God at all. I mean, the very thing he's saying to David is a lie, to get him to allow him to go to Hebron.
Why did it take him 4 years?
Because he was building up his foundation and the people to back him. In Proverbs 21:27, we read, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. So Absalom was going to Hebron ostensibly to sacrifice. Well, we know what God thinks about that. How much more when he brings it with evil intent. All right, so it was 4 years. There were 2 years between Tamar's rape and Amnon's death. 2 years passed. 3 years Absalom was at Geshur after that. 2 years after Absalom returned to Jerusalem, David finally reconciled with him. And then 4 years later, Absalom begins his rebellion, his coup. So 11 years altogether. It's been a while. So it takes time for sin to bear fruit, but it will bear fruit. So So the king responded to him. David didn't sense any duplicity here at all. And there again, I remember back when Amnon was killed, when Amnon had him killed, Jonadab said to David, Absalom has been talking about this for a long time. So evidently it was pretty common knowledge that Absalom hated Amnon and wanted him killed. If it was common knowledge, David should have known about it. And so even here, okay, for 4 years, Absalom is at the gate. The gate of the city is where they conducted business. That's where they had legal business that we see in the book of Ruth, that Boaz goes to the gate to take care of business. So that's why Absalom went to the gate. Well, is David just see no evil, It's like he can't see anything. He should have known what was going on. And maybe he did, but he didn't want to believe evil of Absalom. Who knows? But I think he should have known.
Mine says 40 years.
That's what mine says
40?
too,
40.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is, see, David's reign was only, what, altogether 40?
40.
Yeah. So it's an error. It couldn't have been 40 years.
Mine says
Yeah, a lot of some translations say 4, some say 40, but they do think it's a typographical, it's an error.
King James says 40.
Yeah, yeah. But it couldn't have been 40, he wasn't even 40 years old.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, it makes sense. 4 is,
yeah.
40 is a really long time.
So David tells Absalom, verse 9, go in peace. So he rose and went to Hebron. Hebron, remember, was where David began his reign. He was king in Hebron first before he went to Jerusalem. And when David said, go in peace, it just so happens those are his final words to his son. That was kind of sad thinking about that. Verse 10, but Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron. So it gives us an idea of what he was saying at the gate to these people. But I don't think it was limited to the words that we're reading in those verses. I think Absalom would go ahead and say, if you will just hang in there, I'm going to do something about this. And so when you go back to your home, tell others about it. And, he was just actively seeding his rebellion. So, with Absalom, verse 11, went 200 men from Jerusalem. He took 200 men with him who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. But he must have thought they would go ahead and be with him. I'm not sure why he didn't. I don't know why he didn't say anything to them at this time. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city in Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. So you think, what in the world was David doing all this time? I don't know. In 2 Samuel 23, so we haven't been there yet, it just gives us what's it called? A family tree. What's the word I need?
Genealogy.
Yes, genealogy. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite, was one of David's mighty men. It says he was the son of Ahithophel, and Ahithophel from Gilo. So it's probably the same Ahithophel as here. Now, the only thing, Eliam may have been, there's a lot of Karens, there's a lot of Mariannes, and so it may have been a different Eliam. So we don't know for sure, but Eliam was, in 2 Samuel 11:3, when David sent and inquired after the woman Bathsheba, one said, is not this Bathsheba the daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah? All I'm bringing that out is to say that Ahithophel might have been her grandfather. We don't know for sure. But he was in and around Jerusalem because he was David's counselor. Evidently, he didn't live there, but David would bring him in when needed. So, I've always thought he was her grandfather, and that's why why he didn't like David, because of the way David killed her husband and committed adultery with her. However, and this was brought out by one of the commentaries I read, would the grandfather put his daughter and grandson in jeopardy like it would for him to go against David in this, unless he thought Absalom had a real good chance and David would be out of it. I don't know. So it doesn't matter a whole lot. To me, it's interesting to try and figure out motives for people. But we do know that David felt close to Ahithophel. He wrote Psalms 41:9. It's pretty much agreed that this is what he wrote concerning Ahithophel. Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. And it's interesting, Jesus quoted this verse also talking about Judas. John 13:18, Jesus says, I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I've chosen. But the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted up his heel against me. So I'm not sure David even knew that he was prophesying when he wrote that. So, but it shows us that Ahithophel is a type of Judas, because he turned against David for Absalom. And then back in 2 Samuel 15, verse 13, and a messenger came to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. It's amazing to me that Absalom got as far along as he did with this, but he was laying the foundation of this coup for years. He had it in the works. And so, he almost brought it off. He almost did. But of course, the problem for him was he was working against God. We can lay the best plans in the world, plans that look like there should be no problem at all with them succeeding. But if it's not God, they're not going to succeed. Our plans will not. Absalom probably didn't even think this way. He probably didn't even give God much thought at all, that he should have.
Do people think that way today?
Right.
When they make their plans?
Right.
God's not even in the picture.
Right, he's not.
They think they don't need God, that their plans can come to fruition without God.
Right, right. I was telling someone this morning, whatever reasons we have for not including God in our lives, if we do our own thing and it's sin, we will reap. And, you can tell people that, and I can see on faces sometimes that they think I'm just this old lady with a traditional view of God, and just, you don't really know what's going on. And I told Mom, it's kind of like gravity. I can be determined that gravity is not going to work in my life. I don't agree with gravity. I don't think it's a good thing at all. So I'm going to go on that building and jump off. What's going to happen?
That's a good comparison. That's just
So,
as foolish, isn't it?
it is foolish. People can say until they're blue in the face, if that's a bunch of dumb stuff. That dumb stuff is going to kill them, because God's principles work every time. For one, I want to be on his good side. I want to please him. And not just because his principles work, but because I love him, because he loved me. So when I'm praying for people, I say, Lord, just show them your love. Because, it's hard for us to reject love. It is. So when people act like they do, I think they just don't know. I think they don't know how much they don't understand that love is so real and true and big. And anyway, I'll go on. Verse 14. Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. This must have been such a blow to David, because he's under he understands where his son is going right now. He looked at the situation, and he's a military man, and he knew that Absalom had a good chance of this working. He could see it. And he knew that Absalom, if he's gone this far, he wouldn't hesitate to kill David the king. And that would be, I can't imagine the blow that would be. Judas was with Jesus for 3 years. And then to turn him in knowing they were going to kill him. That would just be awful. But for David, it would have been horrible. But one of the reasons that he advised all his servants and his family, everybody, to leave quickly, it was because he didn't want Jerusalem to be the city of siege. He didn't want that kind of devastation to come on Jerusalem. And it would have been devastating for a battle to be fought there. So the king's servant said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides." So the king went out, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. Not sure why he did that, but anyway, he did.
Just in case.
You know, David is a type of Jesus, real in his life. You can see the fact that he was king, for one thing. He's a type. So as we go along, think about that and some of the things that, if you think about it in that way, you can see some of the events in a little bit different light. Verse 17, and the king went out and all the people after him. And this, to me, I hadn't noticed it before, I hadn't thought about it, but I think most of Jerusalem went out with him. And they halted at the last house, and all his servants passed by him, all the Cherethites, the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath passed on before the king. Now, in looking up the Cherethites and Pelethites, it's a little bit obscure who they were, but they were part of his military. So they could have been part of the bodyguard, and Pelethites, I think, means swift. So they might have been his military messengers. Anyway, 2 groups of men that he used in military ways. And then the Gittites, 600 Gittites from Gath, they were the ones that, remember, David was planning on, he told Achish, the Philistine lord, "I'll go with you, me and my 600 men will fight." I don't think he ever intended to fight against Israel, but anyway, he had 600 men, and I believe this probably, give or take a few, were probably the same men. They had been with him quite a while. And then verse 19, the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why do you also go with us?" He was there with David. "Go back and stay with the king." I'd never noticed this until now. He called Absalom the king. "Go back and stay with the king." So he is calling Absalom the king. And some said that maybe he was kind of fishing for, we're not sure where his loyalties lied, because Ittai was a newcomer. He says this, "You are a foreigner and also an exile from your home. You came only yesterday," and probably wasn't literally yesterday, but a relative newcomer. "And shall I today make you wander about with us, since I know not where? Go back and take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you." It was conjectured also that David, we see and we won't get to it today, but we're going to read in this that he sends spies back to Jerusalem so that they can let him know what's going on. And that's a smart military move. Well, for this man, he could have easily been a spy of Absalom's. David needed to be careful. And so this Ittai was probably obviously a man of war. And so David wanted to make sure where his loyalties were. And so, but Ittai answered the king, "As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives." So he's swearing an oath here. "Wherever my lord the king," he's calling my lord the king, talking about David. So he's refuting what David said about Absalom being king. He's saying, he's not even addressing that. "Nope, I'm following you, my lord the king. Wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." What does that remind you of? Anything? Another place in the Bible? Pardon? Yes, yes, I thought of that too. Ruth said that to Naomi. I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to be with you, and I'll die with you, and I'll be buried with you, and and it's pretty much what this man Ittai was saying. And just as a interesting thought, remember back when David told Achish, "We're coming with you," when Achish was on his way to fight Israel. So David and his men went with Achish, and David had lied to Achish all along, making Achish think that he was loyal to him. So David might be thinking of some of these things. You know, he was street smart where some things were not his family concern, but other things. But David, when Achish said, "You can't come and fight the Israelites with us," and Achish would have let him, but the other Israelite lords said, "No, this is not going to happen." They were wise, and Achish had been bamboozled by David. But David, his answer to Achish was, "What have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered into your service till now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" That's 1 Samuel 29:8. And so, but see the difference between Ittai's answer to David and David when he talked to Achish. So I think David was encouraged that Ittai was telling the truth. He swore an oath. He said, "I am with you." So David said to him, "Go then, pass on." And we find that he does. He fights for David. David sets him over part of the military, and in the battle that comes, he proves his faithfulness. So Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. So there were families that were going out. There was a large number of people that were with David at this point. And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by. And David was loved. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. And I forget where I saw this, so I can't give credit to where it's due, but the brook Kidron was in a valley that lay between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. So that last night when Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane, he would have passed over the brook Kidron. And there was weeping and lamenting when David, the king, passed over. And there was weeping, I believe, in Jesus' heart when he passed over. And then, so we just see a lot of similarities there between David and then Jesus. And the word Kidron means to mourn or be dark. The Kidron Valley was where when they would clean out the temple of all the altars, and when kings would set up defilement in the temple because they were worshiping other gods, then if another king would come along who wanted to serve God, they would burn all those things, those altars, in the valley of Kidron. That's what it was, like a trash heap. So we see now David has left Jerusalem, and that's all we have time for. So we'll start at verse, let me see where I am now. I didn't want to rush through this because it'll be 2 weeks because of the retreat.
We need one more.
Okay, I think they'll have one.